Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to be introducing you to my former colleague, Emily Sullivan. Emily is an assistant professor of philosophy of technology and ethics at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. And she and I have done some work together on issues like trust and explanation, as well as motivated numeracy and some other topics. Emily, thank you so much for your time. I'm really glad that you could join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So the course that I'm teaching this term is on contemporary issues in applied ethics, and some of it is on bioethics, but a lot is on AI ethics. And actually these things come together because one place where AI is being deployed a lot these days is in radiology and going through scans of people's limbs and torsos and whatever, and brains, and trying to figure out what diseases and ailments they might have. And one issue that comes up with the kinds of AIs that are being used to do this is whether they're explainable. And this turns out to be kind of an ambiguous question. So just to get started, can you tell us a little bit about what you understand explainable AI to be and how that relates to these kinds of technologies?
Yeah, so explainable AI is kind of like a suite of techniques that try to give us some understanding of how like a complex machine learning model is making the decisions. So really the way that researchers treat these complex machine learning models is just like a black box where you have inputs and outputs, and there's all this magic mathematics going on in between. And the explainable AI techniques are trying to pick out like high level abstract features that the model's doing to try to make it more intelligible to us to say like, okay, it's listing this one input to this one output. Well, what are the reasons for it? Well, these are the features that the model is relying on more than the other features.
So the idea is not that the algorithm itself gives you an explanation, but that the people who designed it are in a position to say, either in general, these are the things that it's sensitive to, or in this particular instance, here's what was driving the decision.
Yeah, so I mean, the terminology is complicated because in philosophy and philosophy of science, where my work is in philosophy of science, the term explanation is kind of a loaded term that means a lot of different things. It's a normative concept. It has to have like a certain type of deductive structure. It's usually like propositional. But for computer scientists, when they use the term explanation, they're not referring to that. It's like something a little different. So even just like an image can be an explanation. So they have these like saliency map images, which is an XAI technique where, let's say you're trying to classify whether an image is a dog or a wolf, like a husky or a wolf. Then they'll like have this like heat map of the image where like certain areas of the image were more responsible for the decision than other areas of the image. And then that alone is an explanation on their terminology. But at least from my terminology, from a philosophy of science perspective, that isn't enough to be an explanation, but you could use that in an explanation. So in order to make it turn into an explanation, then you would have to say like, yeah, like what the target you're trying to explain is some kind of covering rule or some kind of generalization or something like that. So like turn it into a kind of explanation.
Yeah, so I guess this gets us back to like kind of old school philosophy of science, where people are talking about the hypothetico-deductive model and stuff like that, where explanations appeal to laws and generalizations, and then you've successfully explained something when it falls under that particular law that you're referring to.
Yeah, and you know, people in philosophy of science, that people still kind of subscribe to something like that. So it's more, it can be more complicated, like, well, what the generalization actually means, or what is the generalization? But at the end of the day, it really is this kind of, there's this bigger generalization that the thing falls under, and that's what makes it an explanation. So it might just be like a counterfactual instance that's maybe only relevant for this particular case, but then that still is kind of covering.
Yeah, so you also said that explanation is a normative concept. What do you have in mind when you say that?
Just that it needs to have meet certain relevance criteria. It has to be true in some sense, and it has to have a certain asymmetrical relationship between the thing that's doing the explaining and the thing that you're explaining.
Okay, so the idea is like, if the thing being explained isn't accurately characterized, then there's something wrong with the explanation rather than something wrong with the thing explained.
Yeah, right. So you can, yeah, there's like these cases of like, well, explaining the height of the shadow from the flagpole, like, is the length of the shadow determined by the height of the flagpole, or is the height of the flagpole determined by the length of the shadow? Right, it has to have this asymmetrical relationship. So you're explaining the shadow by the length of the flagpole, not the other way around. Though if you're just engaging in like prediction or something, you might be able to do it the other way around. And so that's one way in which prediction might be different from explanation.
Right. That's helpful. And I guess that connects up with one of the things that explainable AI is supposed to support, which is understanding. Can you say a little bit about the difference between knowledge and understanding, and why we might want to have understanding?
Yeah, so there's debate about if understanding just is a type of knowledge, but if it is a type of knowledge, it's like knowledge of dependencies, knowledge why, so why something happens. So a lot of epistemologists for a long time were only concerned with knowledge that, so like knowledge that the cup is on the table. And so just non-philosophers, that seems kind of ridiculous because of course I know the cup is on the table. But understanding seems more useful and interesting because it's about why and dependencies. So knowledge about like why the sun rises every day, or knowledge about why the cup is on the table. Maybe it's really interesting story for how the cup got there, or something like that.
Very special cup.
Yeah, so you can't think of understanding in terms of just that kind of deflationary view where it's just knowledge of dependencies or knowledge why. Other people think that understanding also involves like unique phenomenology where you kind of like see how things like hang together. So even if you knew the explanation, you still might not grasp it in some sense. So understanding might also involve this kind of grasping of the dependencies.
Right. So I guess the question then becomes, when we're dealing with an AI, say, that is making a medical diagnosis, what is it or the people who designed and implemented it need to offer us in order for us to have a satisfying explanation of the diagnosis that we've gotten? Because it seems like, you know, when the stakes are really high, it's not just a cup being on a table, but like, you know, maybe now I need to go through surgery. I probably don't want to just take somebody's word for it. I want some kind of reasons.
Right. Yeah. And I think this comes into the kind of view that I'm arguing for in the paper, is that we need to be really careful in isolating what it is that we're trying to explain. So these XAI techniques that we're talking about, their focus is not on explaining phenomena. So they're not interested in explaining like disease indicators or things like that. They're really only focused on explaining what the model is doing. And then the question is that the whole model itself maybe, and also the XAI technique could be used in some other kind of explanation that actually explains phenomena. And part of the question is like, how much do we need to know about this complex machine learning model in order to explain phenomena? So like the disease indicators. So on my view, it's not really necessarily a problem that medical researchers are using these black box machine learning models, and that they can, and that the kinds of explanations that they would give to patients wouldn't really change very much from the kinds of explanations that they give now, if they weren't using a machine learning model. And it's
right.
partly
Is that because both humans and machine learning models rely on pattern recognition?
So yeah, so that's part of it. So in the example that I use in the paper is the machine learning model that tries to identify whether like a mole is a melanoma or not. And so I use that as the kind of canonical case where the model has what I call very low link uncertainty, because the kinds of evidence that the model is relying on is exactly the same evidence that human dermatologists rely on, which is just the way that the mole looks. And yeah, but the model, so in that sense, we can gain understanding of diagnosis, of maybe certain disease indicators from the machine learning model without really understanding fully what it's doing. But then there might be other cases where maybe there's more like emerging medical fields where they're trying things out for the first time, where this is another example I use in the paper of this like deep patient model where they just throw a bunch of patient records at it to try to predict a whole suite of different illnesses, like from diabetes to schizophrenia. And so they just like throw everything at it and say, okay, can you predict what it does? And so in that case, I would argue that the link uncertainty is becoming higher. So it's more, the link between the phenomena and the model is more shaky because we don't really have good background knowledge to think that certain kinds of medical records would really be relevant for certain kinds of diagnoses. So even if the model gets things right, it can't really explain anything, but it might still be useful.
Yeah, I guess one of the underlying worries that I had when I read about that example was like, you can end up treating something as an independent variable when it's actually confounded by some other variable. So like, if you run something through deep patient, I'm sure that you could find correlations between, say, race and various medical outcomes. And a simple-minded way to interpret that is like somehow people's biological race is causing them to suffer certain diseases or others. And we know that things are much more complicated than that because the way, and even epigenetically, like in the womb, babies of different races are already being affected by different kinds of poisons in the environment because of environmental racism, let alone, during upbringing, if you get treated differently, you're going to have different outcomes. So I worry with these, kitchen sink models where you just throw it all in, that it's very tempting to misinterpret them. And that can lead not to understanding, but actually misunderstanding.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree, right? And so the question that I'm dealing with in that paper is whether, well, people like to blame model opacity on that, right? That like, oh, if we only knew what the model was doing, then we would somehow solve that problem. But in order to answer this question of like the confounding factors and things like this, it's not about model opacity, it's about connecting what the model to the actual target phenomenon, whether there's even support for that. And that has to be done outside of the model.
Yeah,
so if it finds that there's a high correlation between race and some disease, okay, that's maybe an interesting hypothesis. And so then we need to say, okay, well, is that correlation real? What is it based on? And then in order to figure out that question, you need to do traditional medical research, traditional research.
right, which would involve things like epidemiology and actual randomized controlled trials where you try to suss out causation rather than mere correlation.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But if you have a machine learning model where you already have that kind of built in to the model, all that causal knowledge and epidemiology knowledge into it, then you could gain understanding from the machine learning model, even if it's still opaque.
As long as you have the sufficient background knowledge to interpret it. Is that the idea?
So yeah, that's the view that I argue for in that paper. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in the paper, you have this phrase, link uncertainty, which I think you've already used once or twice. Can you explain a little bit more what you have in mind when you talk about link uncertainty and how that relates to these concerns?
Yeah. So really, link uncertainty is just like the level of uncertainty or the lack of scientific empirical evidence supporting the link between the model and the phenomena, the target phenomena. So anytime that we're kind of uncertain whether the model is picking up like a real difference maker, then the link is kind of uncertain. But the more we're certain we are about it, that the model is actually picking up something that makes a difference in the real world, then the link uncertainty is low. And so the argument is that most of the time when we're talking about models, not just complex machine learning models, but other models in science, the real question of when we gain understanding from the model is this link between the target and the model.
So that suggests, I guess, that we can't just AI our way out of doing the hard work of science.
No, yeah, no. So yeah, so like one way to think about it is that a lot of people are focused on this like internal opacity question, where I'm kind of pushing people to focus on this kind of external opacity question. So there's like, we need to think about how this externally connects to the real world.
So do you think that there are fields where the connections are better established within AI research, or ones that are especially problematic?
So the ones that I think are especially problematic are the ones that have really high social impact and are relying on these like strange like pseudoscience techniques. So there's a lot of models now that just go based off of physiognomy, right? So that like identifying some like deep personality traits, but also just like identifying traits of someone just by like off their face.
Oh yeah, so you're thinking of like the ethnicity classifiers that they're using in China now?
Yeah, so that's one of them. But then also they like one of the ones I talk about in the paper is they're supposed to identify your sexual orientation by your face. And then they have ones of whether you're like a criminal.
Yeah.
Well, but then like if you're a Republican or a Democrat or just like general like personality traits. So like you might, so one worry is that because there has been this move where for job interviews where it's just like completely automated by AI, where you have an interview, you have to like answer these like preset questions in a camera, and then like an AI yeah. and so I'm sure they're using some kind of personality face software as part of their, you have to like smile the right amount.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, I think those are the most problematic. I mean, I think that And then in the new paper that is just coming out, I argue that depending on those social consequences, then the demand for reducing link uncertainty becomes higher. So in those kinds of things that have these really high non-epistemic consequences, if you use a model in error, right, that you have a higher burden for reducing that link uncertainty. So if we're just trying to, if we're using a machine learning model to see like what kind of planets might have life on it, which ones we should investigate, we don't need to, the standard for reducing that link uncertainty might be quite low, but then for a case like,
Yeah, it's like not super urgent. Yeah.
yeah, right. But if you're using that kind of model, like in a judging like personality or criminality in some kind of judicial hearing, then we have to be pretty certain about that. The model's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah, so I wonder whether you have any thoughts about this recent case with Axon. I don't know if you came across this. This is the company that used to make, or still does make, but also does other things. The what are those less than lethal electronic rifles, tasers. So it used to be called Taser. They decided that they were going to get into AI and rename themselves Axon. And a few years ago, they were talking to police departments in the US about trying to put AI into police body cams. And in particular, to have face recognition that would not only identify who someone was, but also that like their mood, like whether they were aggressive or not, and that this could like somehow inform police decision making. This is terrifying, but interestingly, their internal ethics board told them not to do it, and they actually abided by that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which kind of surprised me because it was, you know, a US company working with the police. So you would assume they would just be as rapacious as possible.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's nice to hear that instead of firing the ethics board, that they took it seriously. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that really scares me with these kinds of AI techniques. And I think part of it is this idea that like we put way too much trust into the systems because they're supposed to be, you know, math, and so that's objective or something, when that's not true.
Yeah, so that actually brings up one of the sort of themes that's been running through this course, which is trust and trustworthiness. We started the course actually by reading Karen Jones's paper on trustworthiness, which was published in Ethics a few years ago. And she argues that socio-technical systems can be trustworthy in some cases, or that they're at least eligible for being the objects of trust. And in particular, that they can be so only when they qualify as agents in their own right. So she has this notion of collective agency. And I wonder about these systems, whether they genuinely qualify as collective agents. It does seem that people do put their trust in them sometimes, maybe a lot of the time. But on the other hand, like they aren't regulated in the way that, say, medicine is regulated. They're not regulated even in the way that trains are regulated. It's just kind of like the Wild West. And it's unclear to me whether something that, you know, could get changed to its code, uploaded at any moment by some random software engineer really qualifies as a collective agent in this regard. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I feel like I have a very high standard for agency.
Okay.
I don't know, like, but I also don't know if like, would you, I mean, I'm not too much into this debate between agency and trust, but I wouldn't necessarily think that you would have to tie agency to something being trustworthy. I'm just thinking like scientists, you know, trust their scientific equipment, or like you trust your thermometer. I mean, maybe you don't call it trust, maybe you just you rely on it.
Yeah, that's what Karen would say, is that's mere reliance.
Yeah, but then at that point, that doesn't really, what's the difference between just talking about like, well, we should rely on this or we shouldn't rely on it?
Well, so she thinks that someone or something is trustworthy when you can not only rely on it, but also you're attributing to it a disposition to be attentive to and responsive to your dependency. So whatever you're relying on has to recognize that you are relying on it and treat that as a reason to do what it's being relied on to do. So like, you might think like a well-functioning democratic system would be like this, where, you know, constituents are relying on their representatives, and the representatives know that, even if they don't know every single constituent by name. And part of what motivates them is that they try to act as they're being relied upon to act. Whereas your thermometer doesn't have any of that kind of fancy cognitive stuff going on. And you might think some corporations that use AI or government agencies that use AI are responsive in this way, or at least they aspire to be responsive in this way. But it seems like most of them are just out to make some money.
Yeah, I wouldn't think that. I mean, just looking at the Dutch government as an example, because they've gotten in a lot of trouble with using these systems and like fraud detection. So much so that the EU, you know, ruled that it was unconstitutional, like violated the EU norms of human rights and all these things. And they're not very responsive to the fact that, you know, people's lives were kind of just destroyed by this fraud detection. So not surprisingly, it picked out people from marginalized groups and immigrants as people who were engaging in fraud, who actually they were not engaging in fraud, and they gave them no recourse, in the sense that they didn't even tell them why they were flagged as fraud. They just completely cut off their benefits.
Oh, wow.
And then demanded that they owed back benefits.
It's kind of shocking. There was a similar case here in Australia a few years ago. It was called the robo-debt scandal. And it was the same kind of thing, where an AI was trained to detect fraud. It was just deployed automatically. People weren't given explanations, but they were given huge bills. I know a couple actually, and you know, it can really upend your life.
Yeah, and I mean, and not only that, but so there was a couple of scandals involving fraud, and so one of them was the childhood benefits scandal. And with that one, you know, you're owed, depending on your income, a certain amount of money to pay for, you know, childcare. And so they were saying that these immigrant families were engaging in fraud, and so they took away their childcare benefits. But not only that, it ended up being that a high percentage of these children were actually taken away and put into foster care.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
Yeah. And then, so what did the government do? I mean, the government basically said, okay, we will step down, but we're not like resigning. We're just, you know, stepping down to be this kind of like care holder government until the new election happens. And so that means we can still do business, but we can't like pass anything controversial. And
I heard about this. Then they got reelected, right?
Yes. But
Is it?
but it's a party-based system, right? So you might think that the party isn't responsible, but the individuals running the party is responsible. But the party still kept, the same people in place. And the party could have said, look, Prime Minister Rutte, you should resign and we should put up someone else. But they chose not to do that.
Yeah, so I guess the object of trust or distrust in this case would not be an algorithm, but the government that has chosen to use that to accuse people of fraud, right?
Yeah, so I guess this is like, I would say that you should never trust, like an algorithm itself isn't gonna be an object of trust based on the model that you're outlining. Because it's always going to be embedded in humans making these decisions. And so that's really, so it's like them together. And at the end of the day, it's going to be like, well, is the human treating this, like they chose to deploy the particular model, they chose to maybe perhaps misunderstand what the model is actually doing. And then that's where those bad choices come from. Because the model itself isn't going to be knowingly responsive. It's just like a thermometer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And it seems that in many cases, people use the fact that the technology is new and hard to understand in order to sort of give themselves an excuse to do bad stuff. So it's not actually the technology that's at issue here. It's that there are people who are using it in bad ways, and then they sort of say, oh, that's not me, that's the machine.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think of these machines just as tools, and so we should treat them as tools. And sometimes it's important to regulate the tools themselves, like with guns and gun safety. Sometimes you also need to regulate the people who use the tools, that certain tools can only be used in certain kinds of ways, under certain kinds of circumstances, right? And that's, I think, where we are now, right? We need to regulate both the tool and also the way that they're used in society.
Yeah, so one of the things that you briefly mentioned was this idea of recourse. And I guess, if someone's children have been taken away for any extended period of time, they can't make that unhappen. But if you've been accused of fraud and fined, you could get the money back with interest. So to some extent, recourse is possible in these sorts of cases. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you understand recourse, and maybe say a little bit about your recent paper on recourse and the capabilities approach?
Yeah, so again, recourse, I think, is one of these terms that are used in lots of different kinds of ways. So the recourse literature in computer science surrounds the counterfactual explanation approach, which is one of these XAI techniques that gives you a counterfactual, so instead of saying that these are the features that caused the decision, it'll say like, if you had feature X and Y, then you would get a different decision. So it's giving you this kind of like modal information about the model. And so recourse in the computer science literature is just that you have a counterfactual that you can actually do something about. So a real life example of someone that I know applied for a loan and they were denied the loan because they were too close to retirement age. Apparently this is something you can do in Europe, I didn't know. But so since they were too close to retirement age, they didn't get the loan. So the counterfactual would be like, well, if you were younger, right, then you would get the loan. So that wouldn't count as a recourse explanation because you can't do anything about that. You can't make yourself younger.
It's not actionable, as they say.
Right.
Yeah.
So then they would have to give, maybe the second most important thing was maybe that there was too much debt or something, because then you could in principle, right, pay down some of your debt. But again, like what's actionable is going to be really dependent on the person. So for some people, paying down debt might be just as hard as, lowering your age, right? So that's the idea of recourse from the computer science perspective. But then there's also this idea of recourse that that I think we could maybe just call it contestability or something, that you're able to contest the decision itself. So it's not about like what kinds of actionable changes you could do to reverse the decision, because then you already kind of agree with the whole system that this was the real reason why you should have been rejected, and then I can make changes. Whereas contestability would be, no, those aren't good reasons to reject my loan application. Or that isn't true of me, or something like that. And then you could go and say, like, contest the decision and gain recourse that way.
I actually did this with a Dutch bank when I lived there. I don't know if I told you about this. I was automatically flagged as lying about my criminal record. So when I applied for renter's insurance, I had to check this box that said I didn't have a criminal record, and then I get this thing in the mail saying, actually, you committed assault in the 1990s. I was a child, and therefore we're withdrawing your insurance. And it was so funny. I went in and just to the branch and just showed them this and showed them my passport. I was like, you see what age I was when you were accusing me of this? And they immediately reversed it. So I guess that's like an example of contestability.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. So I think in like everyday language, like that also people call that recourse, right? Yeah. So again, people are using this different kind of terminology. So I think that like the contestability issue is an issue that is solved on more of the way the AI is embedded in the institutions, that you have the space to contest it. Whereas,
so I guess when you have like high link uncertainty, you're likely to need a lot of contestability, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then recourse, in the narrow way that the computer scientists are defining it, then that's going to be how you just regulate the way the system outputs these explanations to people, and how you might constrain what counts as actionability and what doesn't count as actionability. And there you run into a lot of problems, because these systems work best when they make these like really broad generalizations or categorizations. So a lot of the way that the counterfactual explanation methods try to account for recourse is based off of probability distributions. So they think it's harder for you to move from like the 90th percentile to the 95th percentile than it would be for you to move from the 50th percentile to the 55th percentile, something like this. But for some people, it might not be harder to move from 90 to 95 than for someone to move. Well, it might be quite hard for someone to move from 50 to 55, depending on what it is.
Oh, so if you have heterogeneity in the population, then even if you give someone sort of the best recipe for a typical person, it might not be a good recipe for them. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah. Or it might just be something that they don't want to do, and that there's maybe something that's harder that they'd rather go for, just because of like personality quirks or something. Like, I don't, like maybe for example, in order to get into a good college, someone right now wouldn't be admitted, but if they got a higher, 10 or 20 points on the GRE, they would, or the SAT, they would, or if they'd like joined a sports team. Right. So according to this probability distribution thing, it might be much easier for you to just join a sports team, so you just have to like sign up, than it is to get an extra 10 points. That might be quite hard. But for this particular person, like spending the time getting the 10 points might be worth it more to them than joining a sports team, because the idea of joining a sports team is like, hell on earth or something.
Just for the Australian audience here, the SAT is entrance exam for university in the United States, and somewhat oddly, you can get yourself into university as an athlete and not as a student, or not primarily as a student. So it's a sort of a strange world. Great. Well, yeah, the last thing I wanted to ask you about was the capabilities approach. So how do you connect that to this notion of recourse or contestability?
Right, yeah, so the idea there is that one way to define like feasibility is by looking at, well, what is in people's like capability set. And this capability set can include, you know, these desires that they have. So in terms of what their current functionings are, and what's possible for their functionings to be in the future.
Okay. Great. Well, is there anything else you wanted to leave us with?
Yeah.
Hopes for the future, dire warnings, anything in between?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is is just to have this kind of air of skepticism when these new models come out. I mean, they are really powerful and useful, but oftentimes they're just kind of the first step in scientific inquiry and not the final step, which they're usually treated as. And then in order for them to work well, then you still need to have really highly skilled and knowledgeable people who are using these models to make their decisions, but to make sure that the decisions are actually good decisions.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, Emily.
Yeah, thanks.